Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and I have two books to talk to you about this week. Am I sabotaging my own reading plans? Yeah, probably. Do I mind? Absolutely not, because it's keeping me reading. Anyway, I have read two books this week. I'm going to talk to you about both. Neither of them were on my May TBR, and those two books are There Is No Antimemetics Division and I Am a Cat. Did this book help me recover from this book? Absolutely yes. Yeah, it did. I'm going to start though by talking about this book and what it's about. But before I talk about this book, I feel like we kind of need to be on the same page about what memes are and what anti-memetics is, and what memetics are. Because otherwise, when I say meme, if I say meme, you might be thinking of, the pictures, memes. Okay, now that we're on the same page, let's talk about this book. There is no anti-memetics division. Now, what is this book with the really cool foiling and really interesting cover about? Let me read first to you a little bit from the inside of the book. Normally, I just tell you what I think the book is about, having read it, but I feel like the inside of this is like so interesting that it's worth sharing at least a little bit of it. It says, humanity is under assault by malevolent anti-memes, ideas that attack memory, identity, and the fabric of reality itself. In this whip-smart tale of science fiction horror, an entirely reimagined and expanded version of the beloved online novel, you'll end up discovering that these anti-memes that it talks about, they're all around us, hiding in plain sight. One could be in the room with you just to your left. You could be seeing it right now, but from this second to the next, you'll forget that you did. If you managed to jot down a note, the paper would look blank to you afterwards. These entities can feed on your most cherished memories, the things that make you you, and you'll never even know anything changed. So this is a book that I would definitely say is correctly like categorized as like sci-fi horror. I would say it definitely is going to start by feeling significantly more science fiction than horror. I think that's true for probably the vast majority of the book. Did this book scare me? Because I am a huge scaredy cat. I will be honest. Initially, no, it didn't. Like, even when the first sort of quote unquote scary thing happened in the book, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's kind of creepy and weird, but okay, that's fine. Did it scare me in the long run? Yeah, actually, it kind of did. I feel like it was a slow creep, and that at the beginning of the book, it was fine and felt more like a thriller. Then there was a little bit of a creepy moment. And then by the end of the book, I was like, I think I'm fine. That was a bit intense. And then when I was done, like the next day, I was like, I'm so creeped out. And to this day, and this is like a week later, I still couldn't tell you why this book creeped me out, but it did. So do keep that in mind if you're thinking about reading it. At the end of the day, though, this book is about a woman named Marie Quinn, and she works for the Anti-Memetics Division, at least as far as she knows. She's pretty sure that is true and has been true most likely for a while, because as it says, there are these anti-memes that are going around in the world. And it does take you, at least if you're me, a little while to figure out what exactly these anti-memes are, and that may be a little bit of the trick of understanding this book. But anyway, like I was saying, Marie, she works for this division that is trying to prevent these things from taking over. I mean, they're not even really quite sure what they're doing. It's definitely playing with the idea of how much our brain and our understanding in our brain of what's going on in the world is connected to our vision. And this was a really interesting book. So let's talk about what this book is about. I'm going to put it down for a second so I can hold up my little notebook here and read to you what I wrote down it's about. It discusses memory, history, and how they're kind of related. Definitely gets into the idea of identity, because obviously if some of your memories are being erased and it's not up to you, then do you really know who you are, what you do, and if your identity is in some way attached to your memories, how is that affecting who you are and how you see yourself? It gets into a lot of discussion about memetics, this concept of anti-memetics, and just ideas in general and where they come from. It is getting into the concept of the battlefield for the mind and imagination. And it also touches on the idea that we are our best idea. Or the best idea that we're capable of coming up with. And if you're wondering like how this may or may not connect to the real world, or if this is just a fantastical like thought experiment, I would say that even though it doesn't necessarily get into this in the book, but it does make some subtle commentary about like propaganda and things like that, and just the ideas that are being put out in the world that may rewrite our history. So I think that is very relevant to a lot of things going on in the world today. So let's talk about what I thought this book did well, because there was quite a bit of this story that I really enjoyed. Actually, before I get into what I thought this story did well, I think I should talk about how this story came about, because depending on when you read this book or when you read this book, I may end up sounding like I'm talking about something different than what you read. And the reason is, as you may have noticed in the description that I read to you from inside the book, it mentioned the online novel. This was originally created as actually an online series of short stories about the Antimemetics division. And I think that's important to know because it was first online as short stories. And then I believe it became a self-published like online novel. And then I think there are actually print editions of that. And my understanding is that that self-published sort of online novel or print novel is actually still feels like interconnected short stories that are about the Antimemetics division. But then last year in 2005, this was actually traditionally published by I think it's Ballantine Books. I'll put their name up on the screen. And that's important to know because if you want to read this exact edition that I'm talking about, then you need to pick up the edition of it that that publisher put out. Because I've noticed that some people in their reviews of this book are like, this book feels very clunky and the chapters don't feel like they connect. And that's because originally they didn't smoothly connect. They were like a short story collection about the Antimemetics division. Okay. So now back on to what I did like about this book. I actually did think it had a through plot. It felt pretty consistent to me, and I thought the plot was really engaging. Like the first 3 chapters in this book had me hooked. I was ready. I kept going. My mouth dropped open during chapter 1 because I did not see any of that coming. Each chapter feels weird in its own crazy little way, and I think this book does a really good job of bringing you, the reader, into this experience of chaos and confusion that everybody in this world, and particularly in this like government department, is starting to experience. If you don't like books where there's a lot of chaos and confusion and you don't always know what's going on and neither do the characters, this may not be the book for you. You do get quite a few answers towards the end of the book, but I will say it does kind of do the sci-fi thing where a lot of the explanations kind of sort of come towards the end, but are very tied into science fiction and science. And so you may have to do some legwork to actually understand what is being said and what's going on. It is a fairly complicated explanation at the end of the book. I did find the characters in here to be really relatable and lovable in some cases, and I came to enjoy them more and more as the book went on. One of the characters I started to feel like I wasn't liking, but if you wait until the end of the book, even that starts to kind of make a bit more sense. There was a really touching moment towards the end of the book that I wasn't expecting and didn't see coming, and I was like, oh no. And honestly, I would love to see this as a movie. I think it would be really good. On the other hand, it would also be really creepy, which means I probably wouldn't go and see it. So I guess I can just wish for it and not worry about whether or not that wish ever came true. As I mentioned earlier, this book is creepy, but it's a very slow build to creepy, and I can't wait how that would be for somebody else. I have a very low threshold for horror, so a lot of people may not find this scary or creepy at all, to be honest. The main thing that I didn't enjoy in my reading experience of this book is, like I mentioned, towards the end and throughout, it can feel kind of convoluted. The ending and how things wrap up and what happens at the end is actually a little bit hard to understand in some points, but I feel like for me, I got the gist of what happened and the intention and purpose and reason for it. And personally, that felt good enough for me. But it is something to keep in mind, and I think was a little bit of a drawback of the book. And it's hard to tell if that's just because of the way the short stories were connected at that point, if that was the writing, or if there was just something personally I wasn't understanding about the scientific explanations. Either way, I feel like plot-wise, I understood what happened and what the meaning was of that, and that is frequently enough for me. This is a book I see myself rereading, and my hope would be on the reread that I would understand some of the explanations of things at the end of the book even better on the second time. I think the main things that are going to stay with me from this read are going to be sunshine, which, if you know, you know. The relationships in the book as a whole, and definitely the plot twist. There were some really interesting plot twists in here that I did not pick out, I would not have guessed, I did not see coming. So there were multiple times while reading this where my mouth just dropped open and I was like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. I would recommend this book to anybody who likes at least kind of creepy stories and doesn't mind like a little bit of like, weird body stuff happening to people due to aliens. Like if you like the movies Aliens or Predator, like you'll probably be just fine with this. I don't think it's as scary as those movies, but it's also not a movie, so maybe as a movie it would be as scary as those. It probably would be. I think if you like plot-driven novels, you will really enjoy this book, especially if you like novels that have sort of complicated plots going on where you really kind of have to pay attention to each scene to try and figure out like everything that's going on as a whole, because you're going to have moments where you're going to feel like that was an interesting chapter, but what does that have to do with anything? And you might have to wait a few more chapters to come back to that idea or person or place. And I think this is also a really good book for people who like to think about thinking. So I, I, it's hard to explain what I mean by that, but if you enjoy just thinking about thoughts and ideas and things that go on in your brain, this is a good book for that. So I haven't mentioned yet, but I actually rated this book really high. I gave it 4.5 stars. It was almost a 5 star for me. If there was anything that knocked it down to the 4.5, it's because of sort of the convoluted nature of it. Particularly at the end and near the end of the book, because there was one point where I thought there was actually a little inconsistency in something, but I won't be sure until I reread it again. So my guess is on a reread, it'll either stay at a 4.5 or go up to a 5, but I definitely plan on reading this again. Would I recommend it to everyone I know? Absolutely not. Apparently, I think the original version of this can still be found online. I'm not 100% sure of it, but I will put the site that it was originally listed on. So in case you're interested in checking out more science fiction that I believe is along these same ideas. To me, if you're looking for a book that this reads like or would like a comparison, I would think of Jennifer Government. That was the first book that popped into my head while reading this. I think the action and the pacing of the book and the plot and the sometimes ridiculous feeling activities reminded me of Jennifer Government. And if you keep going in the book, what feels ridiculous at the beginning of the book gets explained much better later, and later does not feel ridiculous at all, like makes perfect sense. So if you start this book and you're like, this kind of feels silly and crazy and like, really? Like that just all seems way too convenient. Like just keep reading. That feeling will probably go away. The other book that this reminded me of is XX by Rian Hughes. That is actually another book that talks about memes and ideas and the idea of them being maybe sentient beings or something. but existing in our world in a way that we're not expecting or anticipating. So if you liked the discussion of memes, or in this case, anti-memes, I would highly recommend XX. Very different feel, not scary book at all, but you'll get more discussion about ideas and how they exist in and maybe outside our head. And sadly, because I feel like this is kind of like a underground sort of work, if you will, and not super well known, like in its physical format, or outside a certain science fiction community, I personally couldn't find any other books that I haven't read, and get book recommendations of things that I would personally like to read in the future. So if you have read this book or understand the types of concepts that it's covering and have any books that you would recommend, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, because I'm definitely interested in continuing to read about this topic and exploring this world, especially if the books aren't creepy. Like I really had a couple of like days, nights where I was like freaked out by just walking around in space and existing in the universe. And again, like for no particular reason. It was like, it's not because I was actually thinking maybe there's someone in the room with me, but I think the whole book just gives you that feeling of like someone looking over your shoulder, because that's what's happening to a lot of people in the room. And so I think eventually, because you keep thinking about that idea, you start feeling that way. Paranoid? Is that the word that I'm looking for? I don't know. Tea break. Oh, it's good. I have blue acai. Oh, there's like literally nothing on this tea bag tag. Anyway, it's really delightful blue acai, no, blueberry acai green tea is what it is. After being completely creeped out for a couple of days by my previous book, I was like, okay, I need to get my act together, and maybe I need to replace those thoughts and ideas with other thoughts and ideas that are more comforting and soothing and lighthearted. And so I decided, what better to change my mood than a book? And so I decided to pick up I Am a Cat. Is this on my May TBR? No. Also, no. Nope. Because I looked at the rest of my May TBR and realized those were a series of other dark books and ideas, and I was like, that's not going to help. Did this book help? Yes, in a lot of ways it did. This is definitely a lighthearted work that is narrated by a cat. This is a classic work of Japanese fiction. It came out in the early 1900s and is written by a well-known author, Natsume, or Soseki Natsume, who is the author of Kokoro. And what do I think about this book? I have all sorts of thoughts. First of all, let me tell you what this book is about. So, this book is a story that is told by a cat who, at the time of the start of the book, is nameless. And he is a cat who started his life as a kitten, just growing up outside with his brothers and sisters and his cozy little litter. And, you know, people sometimes call him a stray cat, but that's kind of rude. He is kind of living his best life as a kitten when he suddenly one day finds himself approached by a human and removed from his litter, and he eventually makes his way to a nearby building, which turns out to be the home of a local teacher. And that teacher ends up becoming his master, as he calls him, and he ends up residing in his home throughout his life. So you don't get a lot of his life in his like youth or kittenhood, if you will, which kind of makes sense. Cats age very quickly. So the next thing you know, he's kind of talking about, you know, let's say his middle years and what is going on there. This book chronicles his years in his master's house, really just sort of sitting around and observing the life of his master, making observations on the different people in the household, and just kind of running into and having conversations with the local cats. Because while he can understand what is going on with the humans and what they are saying, he really has no way of speaking with them or communicating to them. And it's a really interesting effect. This is definitely a book where the point of view is very much being used by the author to communicate his ideas and to comment on society at the time. It is definitely a social satire that is looking at people during this changing time in Japan, which is something that this author is really known for. This book was originally published in 10 installations in a literary magazine between the years, I think, 1905 alive in 1906. And so you have a change between traditional Japanese values and ways of living and people looking at, accepting more Western culture values and ways of living and homes and all of those things. And this cat is definitely not holding back his thoughts on any and all of these things. So you largely get a lot of discussion and conversation about behavior, values, and the morals of the time, as seen through the eyes of the cat and as told by our wonderful feline narrator. What did I like about this book? There were quite a few things. So for one, I did mention that this was told in 10 installations in a literary magazine. I'm realizing that that is something that's very similar to both the books that I read in this past week. In this case, originally I Am Cat was written as one short story, not this whole book. This whole book is all 10 or 11 installations. But chapter 1 in this book, if you get the omnibus, which is 3 volumes in one, Chapter 1 of Volume 1 is actually the original short story that was written and was all that the author actually ever intended to write. So it does feel pretty whole and complete in and of itself. The other 10 chapters in the omnibus, or in this series in general, came later because the author was encouraged by the editor of the magazine to continue writing the story because people loved it so much. I really liked chapter 1. I think it sets up the tone of the book really well. You really get a good idea of the narrator's voice, which is a really strong voice. Just in terms of it's very unique and identifiable and has a really particular tone to it. Our cat is pretty catty. There were a lot of things for me to like at the beginning of this book. There are a lot of discussions about cat behavior in daily life that were absolutely charming, like how they greet one another by twitching their tails and everything. I was very impressed by how the author was clearly observing cats in his own life and then able to write down their mannerisms and incorporate them into the story in a fun way. There is some good humor that has been really well translated. This book was originally written in Japanese, and I think a lot of the humor did come across even in English. There are some really funny quotes and just like disses on different people in the books that are like things that would be a solid burn even today. One of the other things that I liked in this book were the truisms, or what I ended up labeling the catisms, where you have the cat just, putting forth what he feels like is true about the world and life in general, and particularly what he thinks about human nature and what human nature is like. Because at the end of the day, I think the biggest commentary in this book is about human nature and, what people are really kind of like, particularly during this time period. One of the things that I also really appreciated about this book is that you do get a Japanese and Eastern point of view on the Western foreigners. And I feel like that's something that we don't see in a lot of books, especially nowadays. And I feel like that's true even in some Japanese literature that I've read, like contemporary Japanese literature. And I really thought that was really fascinating to have that in here and to hear like sort of this reverse sort of looking down at the nose at a culture and people during a time period that you're used to hearing like the derogatory looking down the nose in the other direction, if that makes sense. Okay, let me wrap this up because I'm starting to struggle with allergies for a second here. Anyway, what were things that I didn't like about this book? I think my biggest complaint with this book, and the reason that I soft DNF'd it, and I'll explain why I'm still talking about it now in a second, is that I felt like it was a huge bait and switch. So I mentioned how this book was originally written basically as 11 short stories. I feel like the first story was really strong. I still really liked the second story, even though there was a little bit of an adjustment made in what was going on in the storyline to make it a storyline. I found that forgivable because I knew that the author had never intended for there to be a story 2 or a chapter 2. By chapter 3, however, the author starts telling you, hey, we're shifting directions here. And the direction it shifted from was from the cat to the people. I feel like that's the main reason that would make people want to DNF this book, or at least DNF the rest of the series. Because I think if you go into this book expecting to get a ton of cats and a lot of cat interaction and a lot of cat looking at humans and doing cat things and sharing about his cat life, you are going to be disappointed. This book really is looking at humans and human nature, largely from initially a cat that is very much on the outside of that experience looking in. But as the book goes along further and further in the first couple of chapters, and then certainly as it goes into the other volumes, it becomes a lot more just about the human experience from what starts to feel more and more like a human point of view. So, that said, I'm going to come back to the fact that I ended up soft DNFing this book. So, what I did was I made it to the end of volume 1, which again can be sold and is sold as just a single novel. And I decided to end it there. I read maybe the first 20 pages in the second volume, and I was like, this feels like and kind of is a totally different book. And it's not that I wanted the book to be a lot of conversations between cats. I just really liked the cat perspective on humanity and looking at things through that angle. And I didn't like sort of the tone and the voice and the focus that ended up being picked up once that changed. So I am for now going to say that I just read book 1. So if you look on my story graph, what you will find is that I have put that I think I DNF'd this book, or maybe I paused it, I don't remember. And instead, what I ended up doing so that I could count the pages that I read and make some sense for myself if I come back to this in the future, is I put the cover of the single volume on my story graph and said that I read this book, because I did. I read all of the first book in the 3-book series, if you will, or 3-volume series. So that was that. My ending rating, even for book 1, I think ended up being 3.5 stars. And that was still largely because even within book 1, there is a lot of tonal shift. And I think you can feel the struggle of it kind of trying to come together. And personally, I don't feel like this ever really came together as a novel. My recommendation would be, if you're interested in reading this book, is to see if you can just get volume 1 of it, or to see or check it out from a library, or to see if you can somewhere just get chapter 1 of the story. And whatever you do, I would just recommend reading it as a short story collection. I really don't think it's helpful to people to bind it in a way that makes it seem like it's a novel. I really think each chapter needs to be read as it was originally written, which is as a short, each of them being a short story. And I think if you approach it in that manner, you may find that you will enjoy it better, or at the very least, you'll know when you're no longer interested in reading the short stories. So it's definitely character driven and it's definitely satire. So keep all of those things in mind when you come to read it, and that might help you enjoy the whole series better. I don't know. It didn't help me want to continue once I kind of pulled that all together, but it may help me if I ever decide to pick it up again. I wish I had better things to say about this book, but honestly, by chapter 3 going into volume 2, I was kind of frustrated with the change of direction. But what can you do? Like, you know, if you're an author and you're writing short stories that you never initially intended to do so, like, I guess you're making the best of your situation and form it into something that you really want to write about. And honestly, I think for this author, he really didn't want to continue to write about cats. So that's it for me. That's how my reading week went with those 2 books. I threw the other one over there onto the couch, so I guess I'll just hold up this one. Yeah, it was a pretty good reading week. This book did do what I hoped it would do, which is calm the creep of the first book I read. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Let me know how your week of reading has gone. Let me know if you would choose a creepy book or a lighthearted book as your next pick, and tell me why, because I'd like to know. I think this is the closest I've come to mood reading in a while, and I'm going to tell you now, it's probably going to continue for the rest of the month. I don't know why, I'm just in a mood. So that's it for me today. I will talk to you next time. Bye.